I'm really happy to be here. Actually, back in March, before we all went into lockdown, I was scheduled for a trip to San Francisco. So even if I couldn't make it there this year, I'm very happy to be here in a virtual capacity. Hopefully, it's just as good, and I'm looking forward to engaging in a discussion. So as Melissa said, I'll talk for 40-ish minutes about the core arguments of my book. And hopefully by the end of what I have to say, you're left with a little bit of a better understanding of the very serious consequences for international peace and security that have arisen as a result of North Korea's nuclear program getting to the point where it is today. So, in general, I will be talking through the history of North Korea's various programs, the reason North Korea pursued nuclear weapons, the utility of nuclear weapons for a small state like North Korea, and also hopefully orienting viewers a little bit with considerations from nuclear strategy that North Korea has had to consider as it pursues these capabilities. But with that said, let's get right into it. So let me begin by talking a bit about the theory of the nuclear revolution. So this basically was in the after the first use of nuclear weapons in August 1945 by the United States against Japan, against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It became very quickly apparent that the scale of destruction that nuclear weapons could cause really put them in a class of their own. That warfare had fundamentally become transformed in a way that would also have effects on statecraft. That any country that came to possess nuclear weapons would possess a capability so terrible that its opponents would never want to see those weapons used against them. And in turn, if those countries, if adversaries were to acquire nuclear weapons on their own terms, and a situation of mutual vulnerability were to obtain, where both countries, countries A and B, would be vulnerable to each other's nuclear weapons, that a form of stability would obtain because of that terror that would manifest as a result of these weapons existing between them. And terror is really what underpins the whole concept of deterrence. The Latin root of that word references terror or terror. This fundamental idea that the fear of these weapons being used, because the consequences would be so great, would prevent them from winning. So this is, of course, what led American early Cold War nuclear strategist and historian Bernard Brodie to observe that thus far the chief purpose of our military establishment, that is to say the military establishment of the United States, has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. That by practicing successful deterrence with the use of nuclear weapons, large interstate wars could be prevented. And this was an observation that, of course, wasn't unique to the United States. After the first use of nuclear weapons in 1945, nuclear weapons became widely known across the world. Other countries began to pursue them, notably the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and then China, all of whom are now codified as nuclear weapon states under the later to come Treaty on the Prohibition, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But other countries around the world also saw the value in these weapons, including Kim Il sung, the founder of North Korea and the grandfather of current leader Kim Jong Un. So, what are nuclear weapons ultimately good for? This is, of course, a very contested idea. Scholars and experts continue to debate this today. Are nuclear weapons good for territorial revisionism? Are they good for simply assuring one's nation against existential attacks? Are they good for coercing other states? Ultimately, these questions are somewhat unresolved. But Brodie's observation and that very early idea of the nuclear revolution has had staying power. In fact, it's what's led the 9 states that possess nuclear weapons today, including North Korea, to really seek these capabilities out. On some level, they are seen as the ultimate guarantor of survival. So when it comes to North Korea specifically, what does a country like North Korea hope to gain out of nuclear weapons? But here we need to talk a bit about the history of North Korea and where the country really finds its origins. Of course, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Korean Peninsula was split into two, with a Soviet influenced region in the north under the leadership of Kim Il Sung, and a U.S. allied region in the south. And of course, in 1950, in June 1950, Kim Il Sung went south of the inter-Korean division line along the 38th parallel, initiating the Korean War. At this point, we enter 3 years of brutal warfare on the Korean Peninsula, really transforming the the geopolitical landscape of Northeast Asia in many ways, and that leaves a long shadow in the aftermath of this war, which ends with an armistice in 1953. On some level, for the North Koreans in the aftermath of the Korean War, there has been a long-standing concern that the United States, armed with nuclear weapons, armed with impossibly large military capabilities, would be able to coerce and invade North Korea in the future. So I won't get into too much of the history of the Cold War relations between the United States and North Korea, but broadly speaking, under Kim Il Sung, uh, the a relationship between the two countries remained rather tense, and certainly the relationship between North and South Korea. North Korea, of course, having articulated its original objective at the start of the Korean War being the unification of the Korean Peninsula under its own terms, under North Korean rule. North Korea to this day, having now developed a nuclear arsenal that I'll talk about a little bit in more detail, calls its nuclear forces its treasured sword. It's really and that phrase is used in North Korean propaganda both internally and externally, and it's evocative of the cherished role of these weapons in North Korea's national defense strategy. It also suggests to the outside world that this is not something that North Korea will be willing to part with under perhaps any circumstances, or perhaps under only a dramatic transformation of the regional security landscape. So that finally raises a question of whether this treasured sword will remain in its sheath, i.e., be used strictly for deterrence, or whether it will be brandished to finish the unfinished business of the Korean War. The Korean War did end in an armistice. It is effectively an unfinished conflict that runs to this day, even if full-scale hostilities between the two Koreas have not resumed. But this is really one of the fundamental questions that hangs over the Korean Peninsula today. By all accounts, however, what we know from North Korea's possession of these weapons, from statements that North Korea has made about its own nuclear capability, is that these weapons exist in North Korea's possession primarily for the purposes of survival and for practicing nuclear deterrence against the United States and against the United States allies in Northeast Asia, primarily South Korea and Japan. So let's talk a little bit about Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un inherited the leadership of North Korea after his father, Kim Jong-il, died in December 2011. He's now been in power for almost a decade, a little bit short of a decade. But broadly speaking, he has maintained continuity with his father and his grandfather, although he has his own spin on national defense policy. Kim Jong-un, the way I see it today, has four major goals that really motivate all of his decision making, not just on nuclear weapons, but internal economic statecraft, his broader diplomatic approach to North Korea's allies, including China, and adversaries, including the United States. Ultimately, he seeks to secure and sustain control of North Korea, first and foremost. And this is really this has more to do with the political nature of North Korea, which is one of the world's most peculiar countries when it comes to its political system. It is effectively a Marxist-Leninist monarchy. North Korea has now gone through 3 generations of leadership, from Kim Il Sung, the founder, and Kim Jong Un's grandfather, to Kim Jong Il, and now finally Kim Jong Un. And Kim Jong-un plans to hopefully die of natural causes one day and pass on leadership of the country to his children and keep that bloodline going in the country. So that is the foremost objective. And part of that, implicit in this objective, is also maintaining the North Korean status quo system intact. There has been talk about North Korea potentially reforming and opening up as China did in the 1980s, or pursuing a Vietnam-style modernization, but none of this can really coexist with the nature of the North Korean system, which remains closed off to information from the outside world and really privileges the Kim family above all. So one of the tools to do this, and one of the major objectives that Kim Jong-un has had, has been demonstrating a reliable and credible nuclear deterrent to the outside world. And this is really showing that not only does North Korea have the means to manufacture nuclear weapons, but that these weapons are credible, that they work, and that they can be delivered to the targets that they need to get to. Deterrence ultimately impinges on this paradoxical idea that in order for nuclear weapons to never be called upon in warfare or in a crisis, they need to be perfectly usable. In essence, these weapons need to be perfectly usable so that they are never used. And this is something that North Korea has worked quite a bit to showcase to the outside world under Kim Jong-un. The third objective, and this is something that Kim has really made progress with in the last 2 years, has been elevating North Korea's standing in the world. Some of this has to do with proving its own nuclear capabilities. The club of countries today that possess nuclear weapons is a small one, and entering that club does have a level of prestige, particularly for a country like North Korea, but not just North Korea. Even other states, including India, Pakistan, have discussed their own nuclear capabilities in these terms. But North Korea also sees value for its nuclear capabilities in this way. And finally, this is somewhat, folks take this a little bit skeptically, but it's an important objective, which is that Kim Jong Un genuinely does seek to pursue economic development inside North Korea, even if he is, an effective monarch. He does need to provide some level of economic betterment, if not for North Korea's 25 million people, at least for the core elite of the Workers' Party of Korea. On some level, these elites need to believe that their lot is best cast in with the leadership of Kim Jong Un rather than some alternative arrangement. That's what leads to the breakup of authoritarian systems like in North Korea. So to do this, Kim Jong Un has introduced his own socialist lines, which are prominent themes that guide the country's ideology and national development. One of these ideas included this concept of Pyeongjin, which you'll see on the slide. It's a Korean word that Kim Jong Un borrowed from a speech his grandfather had actually delivered in the early 1960s, not long after the Cuban Missile Crisis. When, of course, one of the lessons Kim Il Sung took from that crisis was that Cuba, as had been demonstrated, could not rely on the Soviet Union for its national defense, because if push came to shove, the Soviets would look out for their own interests. And this was really apparent to Kim Il Sung early on. And in many ways, the North Koreans have adopted this very neo-realist understanding of the international system, to borrow from international relations theory. The idea that small states and large states alike exist in an international system that is fundamentally anarchic. And in order to survive, they have two options. They can bandwagon with partners and seek coalitions. Alternatively, if those coalitions are deemed to be unreliable, as they are, what states can do is seek to help themselves. And through this logic of self-help, nuclear weapons come to have value. But anyways, fast forwarding to Kim Jong-un's presentation of the Pyeongjin line, which he introduced in March 2013, North Korea sought to progress along two parallel paths. One of these paths being the pursuit of a reliable and credible nuclear deterrent, and the other being economic prosperity. And the idea was that nuclear weapons and the possession of nuclear weapons would enable North Korea to have the kind of external security it would need to then pursue economic betterment. And I'll talk a little bit about whether that was a good bet or not, because North Korea, because of its pursuit of nuclear weapons, has been under international sanctions now for more than a decade. And these sanctions have really stymied North Korea's ability to have any kind of normal economic relationship with the outside world. Let's dig in a little bit now into deterrence and how North Korea hopes to practice deterrence, specifically using nuclear weapons. Deterrence, at its core, is the notion of conveying to one's adversary that if that adversary were to take certain action that is adverse to one's interests. For instance, in North Korea's case, South Korea and the United States launching an invasion of North Korean territory across the demilitarized zone, the border that separates the two Koreas, then North Korea would be able to impose costs on South Korea and the United States. And those costs presumably would be so great that South Korea and the United States would be deterred from taking that action in the first place. So that's broadly speaking the mechanics that are necessary for deterrence to obtain. And deterrence exists absent of nuclear weapons. In fact, one of the answers for why we never saw a full-scale resumption of the Korean War between 1953 and North Korea's completion of its nuclear deterrent, as it called it, in 2017, can be attributed to conventional weapons, non-nuclear capabilities that the Korean People's Army, North Korea's armed forces, have maintained, pointed at Seoul, the metropolitan area of which contains 25 million people. And this has been deemed sufficient for decades to allow this kind of deterrence to persist. Of course, the United States and South Korea never quite sought to affirmatively invade North Korean territory after the 1953 armistice, but North Korea nevertheless perceived this as a threat. And of course, the United States and South Korea have practiced deterrence of their own, augmenting their own military capabilities. In the late 1950s, the United States introduced tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. And at that time, the quantitative balance on the Korean Peninsula of military forces favored North Korea. North Korea's armed forces were significantly larger and better equipped than South Korea's were. So the United States introduced tactical nuclear weapons to the mix. Those weapons ultimately left in 1991, and I'll come back to that a little bit in a little bit. But with the procurement of nuclear weapons, North Korea has now sought to take advantage of that logic of the nuclear revolution, promising that under any and all circumstances, its ability to deliver unimaginable costs to South Korea, Japan, and yes, the U.S. homeland has now been realized. So North Korea now seeks to hold at risk military targets in South Korea and Japan early on in a crisis. Basically, the North Koreans are concerned that under certain circumstances, the United States might pursue a war of regime change. And why would they think that? Well, we can look back to recent history, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the 2011 NATO coalition campaign against Libya that resulted in the death of Muammar Gaddafi. And North Korea references these campaigns and has studied these campaigns carefully. And it sees the United States' ability to wage conventional conflicts that can result in the deaths of autocratic leaders like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. So by holding military targets in South Korea and Japan at risk, North Korea can effectively assure itself that it would be able to degrade the United States' ability to successfully carry out an invasion. We maintain around 50,000 troops in Japan on fixed bases and 28,500 troops, give or take, in South Korea alongside several advanced assets, including fighters and other heavy equipment, including warships in Japan in particular, where there's a forward deployed aircraft carrier. So by striking these bases early with nuclear weapons, North Korea can degrade the United States' ability to carry out an invasion. Nuclear weapons, due to their sheer destructive power and ballistic missiles, using ballistic missiles to deliver these weapons, are a very good way of promising to make that threat credible. So North Korea has been very clear about this, and I'll demonstrate a few of the ways they've done that through their messaging to the outside world. But secondly, it's not just enough to hold military targets in South Korea and Japan at risk, because we've been talking now about the North Korean nuclear threat for really around 30 years. This has been a problem that's been on the non-proliferation agenda, at least, for a long time now. And North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. So presumably, even if that test wasn't entirely successful and the capability represented there was very rudimentary, for South Korea and Japan, the North Korean military threat has been real in a way that it hasn't been for the United States, at least not until 2017, which was the first year North Korea tested a ballistic missile capable of ranging the entirety of the continental United States. Certainly San Francisco, but also here in New York City, where I'm based, and also all the way down to Florida, where the president's Mar-a-Lago retreat is based, of course. Holding the U.S. homeland at risk fulfills an important purpose for North Korea's nuclear strategy. Because as I just talked about, if North Korea conducts a nuclear attack against US military bases in Japan and South Korea before the United States has attacked North Korea, presumptively that would lead to an all-out American campaign against North Korea. But here's where the North Koreans calculate that if they held certain weapons in reserve, for instance, if they maintained their very long-range capabilities, their intercontinental range weapons, and they didn't use those, they could then still have the ability to punish the United States for retaliating against that first attack by striking mainland targets, including cities. And the logic there would then be that no American president would take that bet. Even if nuclear weapons had been used against military facilities in South Korea and Japan, the possibility of a nuclear weapon making it to the US homeland would presumptively deter a US president from following through on our treaty obligations to Japan and South Korea. And this is what's known, or at least was originally coined during the early Cold War as decoupling. Splitting us apart from our allies, which has been a long-term North Korean objective. North Korea has sought to evict the United States from Northeast Asia, where we maintain a forward military presence, and we do that through our alliances with South Korea and Japan. So all of this is, of course, very logical and sounds like a neat strategy, but of course, none of this is neat or easy. In fact, the business of making one's deterrent credible is quite messy. So North Korea has sought to credibly communicate its capabilities, ultimately to realize the benefits of nuclear deterrence. And that has been a task that has been ongoing for more than a decade. But under Kim Jong-un in particular, North Korea has crossed the most important milestones, effectively reaching a point today where it has a minimal deterrent. And the phrases that North Koreans have used to talk about this, including North Korea's foreign minister in 2017 when he addressed the UN General Assembly here, the phrase they've used is equilibrium of force or balance of power. effectively going back to that Bernard Brody quote, implying that there is a level of stability now because the United States has nuclear weapons with which we can hold North Korea at risk, and North Korea in turn can also hold the United States at risk. And presumptively, if there is that equilibrium, there is a certain level of stability in the North Korean view. This is again a contested idea. Of course, North Korea is a much smaller country. Their nuclear forces are 2 orders of magnitude smaller than that of the United States, and that does have implications for how stable this deterrence can be. In fact, I would argue that our relationship with North Korea in these early years after 2017, when North Korea completed many of its most important capabilities, is very dangerous because North Korea has a lot to fear from the United States today. So this is a old picture. I hope this is showing up well across the stream, but if it's not, I have another one that will also illustrate this point. But this is a manipulated photograph of a North Korean missile test. The photo has been turned upside down and been slightly elongated. Here you see Kim Jong-un's hand holding a pointing instrument at a map. And on this map, you see a missile trajectory. The trajectory isn't showing fully, but broadly speaking, you have the Korean Peninsula here, you have Japan here. Iwakuni hosts a U.S. Marine Force airbase. And at this missile test, Kim Jong-un pointed at this map, and North Korea released photographs because it wanted the outside world to know that the missiles, had they been flown in a different direction, would have successfully ranged that Marine Corps airbase at Iwakuni. And that's a form of communicating credibility. These missile tests were successful, and North Korea wanted the outside world to know that in a conflict or a crisis, these missiles would be available and they would fly just as well, and they would be delivering nuclear weapons to the U.S. force, to the U.S. Marine Corps base at Iwakuni, presumptively degrading the American ability to then carry out a campaign of retaliation against North Korea. This image was released in 2013, long before Kim Jong-un had actually overseen some of his most prominent milestones, including the test of an intercontinental range missile, and even the test of a high-yield thermonuclear warhead, which he did in September 2017. But behind Kim Jong-un here, you see this map. And part of the map was cut off in the image that the North Koreans originally released, but you can make out the outline of North America here, the United States here, and you see these lines that lead back to the Korean Peninsula. And each of these lines leads to a target of interest. That this was effectively North Korea's way of telling us, previewing the years to come. Show us this in 2013. Tell us that these are the targets that they'd like to hold at range, and then let the fireworks flow as they gradually test their capabilities and realize these capabilities. Analysts have called this the map of death. It's not a very subtle way to communicate one's objectives, but it certainly does the trick. You don't need to speak Korean to appreciate what this map tells you. You see Kim Jong-un here, carefully scrutinizing these maps, surrounded by his top men, many of whom are involved in the missile program and would return to oversee missile tests in the near future. And before I move on to talk a little bit more about capabilities, which will get a little technical, but I'll try to keep things accessible, I do want to talk about Kim Jong-un in his own words on nuclear weapons. And these words are very recent words. These come from a speech he delivered earlier this year. You might have seen in the news that North Korea just held a very large military parade to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea, its ruling party. Kim Jong-un, for the first time in my recollection, directly addressed the conditions under which North Korea would use nuclear weapons. And I've highlighted the important bits in red here. I won't bore you by reading this out in full. It's also in the charmingly broken English that often comes to us in official North Korean translations of Kim Jong-un's remarks. But broadly speaking, the important part here is any forces that infringe upon the security of our state and attempt to have recourse to military force against us, Kim Jong-un will enlist our most powerful offensive strength, i.e. nuclear weapons, in advance. And I'd emphasize in advance here because that implies North Korea would use these capabilities first. And that's a disturbing idea. Whenever I do these talks, a lot of audiences recoil at the idea that North Korea could ever use nuclear weapons first because it would be suicidal for them, because we would retaliate. But it's precisely because of that logic I explained earlier, of holding those ICBMs in reserve and holding the American homeland at risk, even if nuclear weapons had already been used in Northeast Asia against military targets, that makes this logic so powerful. And here at the end, I really like this line since I think it really emphasizes that sort of neo-realist understanding of self-help that North Korea, that really imbues North Korean thinking about national defense. If we don't have our own strength, the only thing we can do is wipe our streaming tears and blood, even though our fists are clenched. So this is really it's an articulation of the idea that a deterrence needs to be credible not only for manipulating one's adversaries, but because these are ultimately going to be the tools that assure national security for a country like North Korea. So here's another quote from 2017, which was that very prominent year that North Korea tested many of those critical capabilities. This comes from a person significantly lower down on the food chain, Sin Hung Chol, former deputy foreign minister and now actually ambassador to Russia for North Korea. But he also articulates this idea: if we notice any sign of assault on our sovereignty, notice any sign. So note here that this does not actually require North Korea to already have suffered an attack. If we notice a sign that an assault is coming, for instance, if North Korea notices American ships are beginning to amass at a U.S. naval base in Yokosuka in Japan, or it notices that the U.S. is flying a lot of bombers around the Sea of Japan, if it notices these signatures, as he says here, our army will launch merciless military strikes against the U.S. aggressors wherever they may exist, from the remote U.S. lands being a reference to our Pacific territories, most notably Guam, where Andersen Air Force Base is a major operating facility for American strategic bombers, both nuclear and non-nuclear capable, from the remote lands to the American military bases on the Korean Peninsula, such as those of Japan. That's again a little bit bungled English, but implying that American military bases, forward bases like Guam, are to be included in that first strike that North Korea would use to ensure that the United States would not have the wherewithal in region to carry out a military campaign successfully. These are a few additional statements. Again, I won't read these, but again, these underpin the North Korean obsession with rendering deterrence credible. And by the way, at any point, if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A tool about any of these slides. I'm very happy to come back and dig in more detail if that's of interest. These, the Hwasong 12, Kokuksong 2, these are names of North Korean missiles and other new types of strategic weapons, showed their capabilities for actual war. Effectively, these are credible missiles, that they fly, they work, that these are going to be available to North Korea in a crisis. And he also notes here, this is a KCNA, North Korea State News Agency, notes that the ICBM Hwasong 14, which was their first ever intercontinental range ballistic missile, tested on the 4th of July, American Independence Day in 2017. This missile proved that the U.S. mainland is within the striking range of the DPRK's weapons, DPRK being North Korea's official name, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And finally, another clarification here: the U.S. mainland is the final target of North Korea's strategic rockets. So after the bases, Guam, South Korea, Japan have been struck, the American homeland is the final target. And for this purpose, ICBMs would be held in reserve, presumably. So I talked a lot about North Korea's obsession with communicating the credibility of its deterrent, and that obsession begins to make sense when you see sort of popular portrayals of North Korea like this. This is a cover of the New Yorker magazine, released a week after North Korea's January 2016 nuclear test, its fourth nuclear test, when Kim Jong-un claimed to have tested an H-bomb. But you'll note, of course, Kim Jong-un is portrayed here as a chubby baby playing with toys. And later, of course, President Trump would famously come to call Kim Jong-un Rocket Man in a transcript that leaked between President Trump's conversation with the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, that same year in 2017. He mocks Kim Jong-un's weapons. He says his rockets keep on crashing. These things don't actually work. And if you're North Korea, you're very well attuned to this perception of your country as this tin pot dictatorship, tiny, North Korea's GDP. We don't know what it is exactly because we don't have great economic indicators, but most available estimates put it on the level of what the United States spends on 2 aircraft carriers. That's the entire country's GDP. So how can a country, and we can go back to the Cold War when President Nixon called North Korea a fourth-rate pipsqueak of a country. And these perceptions have been enduring, and North Korea has been trying to sort of change this view and very seriously communicate that yes, you might find us odd and you might find us funny and you might not take us seriously, but we have missiles that fly, and we'll show you how these missiles fly. We'll conduct tests. We'll conduct nuclear tests, and that's really to make deterrence credible. And in a major way, North Korea has succeeded in doing that. So here's another example of an attempt to do this. This was an image released in March 2016 of an undated image. So we don't know exactly when this photograph was taken, but it was released in March 2016 of Kim Jong-un overseeing what appears to be a a fission bomb, a simple one-stage fission bomb, a rudimentary nuclear weapon, but most importantly, one that is compact enough to be mated to a ballistic missile. And in the background here, Kim is standing next to an intercontinental range ballistic missile. So the message to anyone viewing this is fairly clear. It's that this will go into that, and that will fly to the U.S. homeland. A little side note, this missile was never actually tested by North Korea, but they tested other ICBMs that certainly would be able to accommodate this specific weapon. And Kim also, there is an artistry to these photographs. Kim is shown at the center. He is ultimately the authority overseeing these nuclear weapons, and it's very clear in this photograph. And there's also an element of communicating civil-military dynamics in North Korea that you'll notice that he's not surrounded by military officers here, implying that it is Kim Jong-un as the chairman of the Workers' Party of Korea who ultimately will oversee the nuclear program and oversee the authorities associated with that program and the use of these weapons. But Kim Jong-un didn't stop here. He had to go bigger. And this is an image that was released a few hours before North Korea tested its largest nuclear device. In September 2017, North Korea tested what is thought to be a nuclear weapon with a yield perhaps 10 to 20 times larger than the weapon that the United States dropped on Hiroshima. The exact yield is not known, but a very large nuclear weapon. This is a more, the implication of this picture, which we know from the shape of the physical weapon that Kim is pointing at, is that outside experts are meant to look at this and think of a two-stage thermonuclear weapon, which are much more efficient designs capable of generating much larger explosive yields. And once again, even though there isn't a ballistic missile present in the background, Kim is not surrounded by any military officers. He's surrounded by civilians in their suits. But right here, I'm not sure if this is going to show that well on the stream. There is a small display containing the nose cone section of an intercontinental range ballistic missile, portraying within it this very device that Kim Jong-un is pointing to. So once again, this goes into that. And at this point, the Hwasong-14, the reentry vehicle shown here, this missile had been tested. And it had already been assessed by American intelligence as having been capable of reaching parts of the US homeland. So this was, again, a very serious attempt by North Korea to showcase this. And this was the same month that President Trump, in his inaugural address at the UN General Assembly, threatened to totally destroy North Korea. And a month before this image was released, he had threatened to bring fire and fury onto North Korea. And why bring those up? It's not to take a pot shot at the president. It really relates to that idea of deterrence, because if the president of the United States is talking about totally destroying North Korea or bringing fire and fury onto Kim Jong-un, presumptively deterrence, this notion of being deterred by North Korea's capability, has not sunk in for the United States. So of course, Kim pushes on. He tests not only this, but he tests an even larger ICBM. He tests a missile called the Hwasong-15 in November. And around this time, you have senior American military officials testifying before Congress, acknowledging for the first time publicly that North Korea has missiles capable of ranging the US homeland, that North Korea has nuclear warheads capable of being compact enough to be delivered by ballistic missile. And then in 2018, we transitioned to a process of diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. So before I move on, I do want to talk about a few other capabilities, since like I said, we did just have this military parade, and this helps contextualize where we are now in October 2020. And of course, we're speaking right before a US election, so this also will hopefully set the tone for what the next president might have to deal with. This missile right here was the centerpiece, the crescendo of North Korea's latest military parade. Not only is this the largest ballistic missile ever seen in North Korea, it is the largest road mobile ballistic missile. Look at this massive truck. It has 11 axles. It is the largest road mobile missile anywhere in the world, in North Korea. And people tend not to, again, have trouble believing this, because again, how could a country like North Korea really master the technologies necessary to realize a capability like this? But again, North Korea uses its military parades to introduce new capabilities like this. And Kim Jong-un last December, after negotiations with the United States had fallen apart, and I'll get to those negotiations momentarily, had hinted that a new strategic weapon would be around the corner, effectively implying that his capabilities in 2017 weren't good enough to get the United States to take the hint, and more would be necessary. We haven't yet seen this missile fly. There are serious questions about what exactly North Korea is doing with a missile this large. It is not a particularly desirable missile to operate day to day. There's a lot of obstacles to operating something this large that I'm happy to address in the Q&A. But it is very possible that if, let's say, a new president is elected, if Joe Biden becomes president, North Korea wants to send a message, they may look to test this, or even if President Trump is reelected and there's a second term and North Korea wants to set the terms for a new round of diplomacy, they may look to similarly emphasize that their capabilities continue to advance and that time is not on the United States side. Just a few other missiles to point at. This is the Hwasong-15, previously the largest missile shown by North Korea, but certainly the largest ballistic missile ever tested by North Korea. This was tested once in November 2017 and is assessed by the American intelligence community to be capable of ranging the entirety of the United States, all the way down to the Florida Keys with a thermonuclear warhead. So this is North Korea's, the centerpiece of North Korea's strategic deterrent right now. This missile is the Hwasong-12, and it's a notable one to talk about. It's a little, it's actually much smaller than the two missiles I just showed you, but this is North Korea's so-called Guam killer. This is the missile that they developed specifically to hold at risk the U.S. territory of Guam, Andersen Air Force Base. This is capable of delivering a nuclear weapon to Guam, but not only that, North Korea in September 2017 tested this missile, not long after that nuclear test I discussed, and it ranged, it physically demonstrated a flight range capable of bringing Guam into North Korea's range. So like that earlier graphic I showed of that North Korean trajectory, potentially striking the U.S. Marine Corps base in Japan, the test that North Korea carried out in September, had it been carried out on a different trajectory, it would have actually overflown Guam, very credibly indicating to the United States that Guam was now within reach of North Korea's nuclear weapons. I should also note that when North Korea tests many of its longer ballistic missiles, with the exception of this missile right here, it tests them on a very sharp trajectory. So ballistic missiles fly on roughly a parabolic trajectory, subject to physical forces, including gravity, and when in the atmosphere, aerodynamic drag. But the way North Korea ensures that it's not overflying Japan or physically shooting an ICBM, right next to California or anything like that, is it, shoots these missiles almost straight up so that they splash down in the Sea of Japan, and they're able to get important data on the performance of the engines underlying these missiles as they develop them. But I won't bore you with too much rocket science. Here, this is a slide that really indicates qualitative progress in North Korea. So these systems here, so this is what's known as a solid propellant rocket motor. These have certain advantages for not just nuclear armed states, but really any country seeking to operationalize missiles. Many of these older missiles I just showed off, including all three of these missiles, are they use liquid propellants, which means that before they can be used in a crisis, their fuel and oxidizer has to be physically put into the missile. It's an arduous, time-consuming process that can mean life or death for North Korea if the United States is looking to conduct a preemptive attack, for instance. Solid propellant missiles powered by engines like this are ready for use at the drop of a hat, or effectively at the drop of a hat, at least with significantly less pre-launch preparation than liquid propellant missiles. And North Korea has been investing considerable resources in developing these. And it's quite clear about its ambitions. In 2017, April, it demonstrated, these are mock-ups, these are not real missile canisters, presumably, but North Korea is indicating that it seeks to have not only solid propellant missiles, but solid propellant ICBMs that can be launched without requiring them to be fueled for hours, potentially leaving them, sitting ducks to preemption by the United States. And it has, North Korea has also communicated its advances here. So Kim Jong-un, this is a visit that he did in August 2017 to a factory on the country's east coast involved with advanced composite materials. And here you see a partially finished airframe for a ballistic missile using solid propellants. But you can see from these grooves that they're using a advanced manufacturing process using Kevlar fiber to manufacture these missiles, very much indicating that they are making real progress with these technologies. And lo and behold, at the latest parade, they showed off this very large solid propellant missile. And I can talk a little bit about how just from looking at images, we know certain missiles are solid propellant or liquid propellant. But this one is a solid propellant missile. It has never been tested before. But to my eye, it looks like certainly the building blocks for a North Korean solid propellant ICBM. So there is still more room for North Korea to go. So for all the milestones they crossed in 2017 with their thermonuclear weapon and their intercontinental range ballistic missile, they are still progressing. I'll talk a little bit about command and control. This is really the part of maintaining a nuclear arsenal that few people talk about, but it is in many ways the most important. A command and control refers to the systems and processes that ensure that a valid launch order can be implemented, that Kim Jong-un, when he needs his nuclear weapons and orders their use, that those orders are passed on into the military bureaucracy and then implemented and nuclear weapons are actually used. But in order to ensure that that can happen, North Korea needs to have certain communications capabilities, infrastructure. In the United States, we take this very seriously. We have incredibly redundant, incredibly complex command and control systems, ensuring not only that the president can issue a nuclear launch order within a matter of minutes and that that launch order is faithfully executed after it's been validated by our National Military Command Center, but that our adversaries can't strike and destroy our command and control capabilities. North Korea, of course, can't be as confident in its command and control. And this is always a risk for newer nuclear states and certainly more resource constrained nuclear states like not just North Korea, but this was something that India and Pakistan dealt with after their breakout in 1998 as nuclear states. So North Korea has been quite clear that only Kim Jong-un can authorize a nuclear launch, that there is no pre-delegation, that launch, the military forces, the KPA, the Korean People's Army, does not have the authority to to authorize nuclear use under any condition. So that is a somewhat reassuring component of the way North Korea has implemented command and control. But we need to think about what happens in a crisis, because if Kim Jong-un is concerned about deterrence and the credibility of that deterrence, we, the United States or South Korea and Japan, need to believe that even if even if Kim Jong Un were to be taken out in a preemptive attack, that those nuclear weapons might then be used in retaliation, because how else will Kim ensure his own survival? So this leads to questions about how North Korea might devolve nuclear, or not, sorry, devolve, pre-delegate nuclear use authority in a crisis. If it detects that American bombers, warships, submarines are beginning to amass for a potential attack in Northeast Asia, Kim then might say to his field commanders that they now have the right to use nuclear weapons if they feel that an attack has begun against North Korea. And that's where things start to get very dangerous because of the nuclear strategy I described earlier. We start to get into problems of crisis stability, that the incentives for North Korea and specifically North Korean field commanders to use nuclear weapons first and early intensifies, because they may fear that if they don't use these weapons, they will lose them to U.S. attacks. So I'm running a little slow, so I'm going to rush through some of these slides. So this I won't dwell on too much. This is broadly a description of the capabilities that North Korea has today. But the big capabilities are they have intercontinental range ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons to anywhere in the United States. Whether they can launch those, whether they can fuel those, there are questions there. But they have the capability on paper. And insofar as nuclear deterrence is concerned, in many ways, the North Koreans have calculated that that's good enough. Their nuclear warheads are another matter. They have around, estimates again vary, and North Korea is a very difficult intelligence target, but we think around 30 or so manufactured nuclear warheads, and then they have a heap of fissile material, fissile material being plutonium and highly enriched uranium, weapons grade fissile material that they can manufacture into additional warheads. And they're accruing that fissile material at a rate of around 12 weapons per year. And just to tell you a bit about where other nuclear states are, the United States and Russia maintain 1,500 or so strategic nuclear warheads. China and France maintain in the high to mid 200s. The UK a little bit lower than that. India and Pakistan around the 150 level. But if North Korea continues at this pace, it's quite easy to imagine North Korea outpacing India and Pakistan, certainly, in a matter of years. And apart from that, they have a complete nuclear fuel cycle internally. They can produce plutonium internally with the resources they have. They can mine, mill, enrich uranium for use in nuclear weapons, all from their natural uranium stocks. So they are fairly self-sufficient in this regard. Their missiles, they have received external assistance in the past, but a lot of these missile capabilities are now highly indigenized, that they are producing most of their liquid propellant rocket engines, solid propellant rocket engines, their propellants themselves, all internally within North Korea, which has made external efforts to stymie their progress using sanctions a lot more challenging. Um, Briefly speaking, I do want to get to the prescriptive part of this talk. I've been talking a bit about what North Korea thinks, what they want to do with their nuclear weapons, what they have, but what do we do about it? So for 30 years now, we've been talking about North Korea as a non-proliferation problem. Proliferation being the spread of a technology, in this case, nuclear weapons. The United States decided fairly early in the Cold War that proliferation was bad, that it was bad whether our allies or our adversaries got nuclear weapons. With our allies, you didn't want allies getting nuclear weapons that could then start a nuclear war that we might have to finish. With our adversaries, of course, it's obvious we don't want to live under the threat of nuclear weapons. And in 2017, really for the first time in 46 years, the United States had to contend with a third nuclear adversary that was capable of ranging our homeland with a nuclear capability. China in 1971 tested its first ICBM capable of ranging the US homeland with a thermonuclear weapon. So this was something that American policymakers hadn't really chewed over in a while. But the previous attempts at stymieing North Korean proliferation all fell apart for various reasons. North Koreans are to blame. Certainly, previous U.S. administrations, I would say, made some missteps in overestimating and underestimating North Korean resolve and capabilities. The first prominent attempt, of course, in the mid-1990s under the Clinton administration was the Agreed Framework, which to date remains the only agreement that was able to verifiably freeze North Korea's production of at least one fissile material pathway to the bomb, being the plutonium pathway. North Korea did not have an uranium enrichment capability at the time, which came later, and partly the revelation of that, the revelation of the pursuit of that capability in the early 2000s resulted in the collapse of that deal under the Bush administration. In October 2002, the Agreed Framework effectively collapsed, and North Korea returned to not only reprocessing plutonium for use in nuclear weapons, but it pushed on with its enrichment program. The second attempt beginning in 2003 and expiring in April 2009 was the six-party talks, a multilateral process involving the six parties with major stakes on the Korean Peninsula: the United States, South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, and Russia and China. And that resulted in important breakthroughs, notably in September 2005, a joint declaration in which North Korea agreed to give up nuclear weapons, allow International Atomic Energy Agency monitors into the country, and it did eventually, but ultimately the process fell apart due to the inability for North Korea to acquiesce to any sort of verification protocol. Any of these deals are just as good as their verification component, and North Korea, being notoriously secretive and mistrustful of the outside world, was not willing to acquiesce to that verification. In 2012, under the Obama administration, right after Kim Jong-un's father, died, there was a short-lived attempt to begin a process whereby which we reached an understanding with North Korea on February 29th, 2012, hence the Leap Day deal, or as I call it, the Leap Day misunderstanding. That deal collapsed in a matter of weeks after the North Koreans asserted that space launch vehicles did not qualify as long-range missiles. We disagreed, and we agreed to disagree, and there was no diplomacy to speak of after that. That gets us to 2018 and 2019. This may be the process that most of our viewers are familiar with, being the Trump administration's round of engagement. I talk about this quite a bit in the book. It was a fairly superficial round of diplomacy with North Korea. It resulted in a summit that resulted in a few good news cycles for President Trump. It did not meaningfully constrain North Korea's capabilities. Kim Jong-un facilitated this diplomacy with a few unilateral steps. He pledged to cease from nuclear testing and long-range missile testing. He lifted those commitments in December last year, indicating that he wasn't satisfied with the American negotiating position. And he also demolished his only nuclear test site in an unverifiable manner, collapsing the entrances to underground nuclear test tunnels, among a few other measures. But broadly speaking, this didn't really go anywhere. The United States and North Korea weren't fundamentally on the same page about what was being discussed in these negotiations. The Trump administration was under the impression that Kim Jong-un came to Singapore to give up his nuclear weapons, when what Kim Jong-un really came to talk about in Singapore was coexistence with the United States as nuclear powers. He has no intention of giving up his nuclear weapons anytime soon. Rather, he sought to realize that equilibrium of force, that he came very much as the Soviet Union once came to the negotiating table with the United States during the Cold War to discuss coexistence under the burdens of nuclear deterrence. And that was not really the conversation that we had. And In Hanoi in February 2019, at the second US North Korea summit, North Korea requested sanctions relief, and the United States wasn't willing to lift any sanctions on North Korea. And that brings me to sanctions. I'm happy to address that again in the Q&A. North Korea is the most sanctioned country in the world, under 11 Security Council resolutions sanctioning parts of its civilian economy to punish it for the pursuit of nuclear weapons and missiles, but also restricting its access to the international financial system. Its ships are monitored all around the world. North Korean overseas laborers had to be repatriated after 2017, after the last round of resolutions in 2017. So all of this has still failed to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, because ultimately it perceives nuclear weapons as having existential value, and that's not really something that can be bartered away or have a real price. Did address this. So I'm going to skip to this and just leave a few closing thoughts as we head into the Q&A. So where does this really leave us? And the argument that I advance in the book is that, look, the breadth and depth and complexity of North Korea's nuclear program is such today that it is no longer a non-proliferation problem. They have proliferated, and they have proliferated well, and they have gotten away with it in many ways. And that has terrible consequences for our international non-proliferation regime. Certainly not the only problem. We can talk a bit about Iran and the collapse of US-Russia arms control, but it is one big problem among many. But apart from that, to coexist with North Korea does not mean to accept a nuclear North Korea. It means to recognize the reality that just like we coped with Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China in the Cold War, and we recognize the burdens of nuclear deterrence and the terrible consequences of what might happen if that deterrence were to fail, we now must similarly recognize the burdens of deterrence with North Korea. And that leaves us with a few prescriptions. We might still endeavor to disarm North Korea in the long term, but in the short term, we need to sit down and think very carefully about stability and what might happen if a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, a new round of fire and fury, or a new round of President Trump, if he's reelected, threatening Kim Jong-un with total destruction, ensuring that if that happens, we don't end up in a nuclear war. And we got close in 2017. So there are solutions here. We can think about arms control approaches to North Korea, finding ways, if not to disarm them, then to shape their choices about their nuclear arsenal, to constrain their choices about their nuclear arsenal. And that's where I think a lot of the thinking has to be today. And that requires really a creative, fundamental overturning of the playbook we've used for the last 30 years, recognizing that this problem is going to be here with us to stay for a while. So I'll stop there. Sorry I went a little bit over, but hoping I can still get through most of your questions.